So some of the people on the Q&A panel you might have already seen. Well, you have not seen Michael and Chris yet. So Michael Aldrich and Chris Baker. And I'd like to also welcome on Andy James and James Rosell to help us answer questions. And I think Schmeigel is not going to be joining us for now. So, oh, he is. That is good because
Sorry
I
about
actually
that.
heard that you had a question, Michael, for Michael.
Yeah. First of all, thanks to everyone who presented, but thanks a lot to Michael for coming along and sharing kind of your story and your cluster. That was great and super exciting. And I know not always the smoothest with Alpine, but that's definitely an area that we're super happy that you're working with us on, and we hope to improve in the future. Um, Actually, I have a couple questions, so I'll start with that one actually, which is how is life with Nomad on Alpine today? And what would be the things that are highest priority for you that we could do to kind of fix that or improve that story?
Sure. So life on Alpine is pretty good. Easily the biggest thing is we can't actually use HashiCorp provided builds. We have to compile from source because we need to apply the no NVIDIA build tag. The NVIDIA driver relies on glibc lazy loading behavior, which is not really the greatest on glibc and just doesn't exist on muscle.
That's right. Would a Nomad Lite distribution where it had no built-in plugins and kind of forced you to manually install the plugins you wanted be an option for you, be an appealing option for you? Because that would obviously get rid of the NVIDIA concern. We could build without that baked in and hopefully ship a more cross-platform compatible core library, but it would be more operator work, on the install side.
Yeah, I would say it's a significant amount of work actually to every time a release comes out, compile from source. So to have a Nomad Lite, I would absolutely trade the operator effort of installing plugins to no longer need to go figure out the magic to compile this particular version.
Yeah. Sorry.
To extend on that, one of the biggest things that could be done in that world to make life on Alpine or really just life on not Debian easier would be smoke test builds. We had a really fun experience back in 0.9, which was an eventful release series for other reasons, where we had a failed to build from source. And that really was an interesting day where we had to ask some very hard questions about the reliability of our cluster stack.
Oh yeah, yikes. Yeah. Yes. 09. A lot of lessons were learned in the 09 series for all of us, I'm afraid. And hopefully we don't have to learn them the hard way again. So
we're actually still on 09 in prod.
Oh dear. Oh, there's so many goodies waiting for you.
There are. It's just a little hazardous to migrate right now.
Sure. Totally understand that. So another thing, though, I wanted to ask about too is something that we discuss a lot internally that I don't think we've really taken it to the community before. But I actually kind of noticed you touching upon it a little bit is the bootstrapping problem for the Hashi stack. And I noticed on the resinstack.io, it's listed the #1 known limitation is bootstrapping the Hashi stack. Yeah, maybe I'll let you kind of explain what that is, and if you have any ideas, asks, or particular pain points in there that you want to illustrate. It's something that we're talking a lot about trying to improve.
Sure. So actually, the article you referenced, I wrote late last night when I realized I had a bunch of unpublished draft articles that needed to go up. The bootstrap problem is especially fun for BetterHelp because we run a hyper-converged control plane. On just 3 machines, we run Console, Nomad, and Vault. So we do some service restarting gymnastics to front load keys as we're bringing up clusters. We recognize this is not a particularly supported configuration, and we're moving away from it as a result of the problems we have. To that end, though, easily the biggest problems we run into tend to circle around access control lists, console really being the linchpin. So we can bring up console, we can set up the gossip encryption with it, and it'll auto cluster. But then Nomad sits in this weird, mostly broken state for a couple of minutes while we front load ACLs into console, generate tokens, and then cycle all the Nomad agents. Within the Resin stack, we actually wrote custom software to do this, where it will poll an external secret store. Because this early in Bootstrap, you can't use Vault. Vault isn't live yet. And then once it had all the secrets it needs for a particular service, it just bounces it. And then very importantly, that service exits so that it cannot bounce things once we're bootstrapped. So I think probably the biggest thing that could help is for some of those things, if that could be done online, that would be a major win. We can't really bootstrap the console ACL token online. That's buried deep down in a vendor library. But the big one for Nomad is the Vault token. So the Nomad servers maintain their own Vault token, of course. And having to wait until not only console is up, but also Vault is up to bring Nomad online is a really interesting bootstrapping story, because in my environment, at least, there are some tasks that we would really like to deploy on Nomad very early in the Bootstrap process. In fact, I'd love to run the Bootstrap controller on Nomad, but I can't do that when it depends on these other services. And to a point you raised yesterday during the Nomad office hours, it's an interesting question where people want to say, what is the foundational service? Do you start with console and then everything talks to console? Or do you start with Nomad and you run everything else on Nomad? And my organization went with the answer of console is the foundational service. It was the thing that allowed us to peer data centers, and it just made more sense for us. But I definitely see the argument to go the other way, and I could see how it would make this problem easier.
Yeah, that's perfect. That makes complete sense. And the good news is that there's work in progress to start improving this. I know on the console side, and there's kind of a running joke inside HashiCorp. Nomad often steals directly from console. We let them do the hard work. So hopefully we'll be stealing from them and improving our story as well. But yeah, the Vault token issue is a real one. And I know, yeah, people have had to come up with all kinds of their own solutions around this, including things like running a parent, a hyper cluster of Nomad, but basically at the end of the day, it's a Nomad within Nomad story, where you basically have your infrastructure Nomad cluster that runs everything else, including your application Nomad cluster. And while that works great for some people, that is just a layer of overhead we don't want to force people to go down. So yeah, that's really good feedback. Oh, and I also, you actually touched upon the other question that I wanted to ask already, which is the internally, I like to call it the Hashi tax, the fact that our documentation, our suggested deployment is at least three Nomad servers, at least 3 console servers, at least 3 Vault servers now that, Vault has Raft and all that. That's a lot of servers that we ask people to run all the time, to maintain all the time. So yeah, it was really interesting to hear that you run them hyper-converged. I would love to know what you're moving to and just kind of your experience with that in general. And if you have any ideas on how we could lessen that burden. Because obviously it works hyper-converged. Yeah, I'll shut up and let you talk.
Sure. So I'll start off with saying when we did the initial cluster rollout, it very much was a tax. And at the time, we were not running very many worker machines. So running as few as possible machines that weren't running revenue generating workload was a business decision. As time's gone on now, we scaled up massively as everyone became stuck at home. It turns out this is something that a lot of people don't handle quite as well as they might have hoped. When we're running 80 service machines, 9 more servers doesn't really impact. So some of the things we've noticed while running this is we often refer to a concept of machine criticality. If I lost that machine right now, how bad would it be? And we refer to this both with application machines that perhaps we didn't understand constraints well enough and we wound up with a dozen cache nodes on them, or things where the control plane perhaps is we have every leader is on the same machine. That's a problem with the hyperconverged stack. And to that end, we are concerned that running the hyperconverged control plane, while fiscally less of an issue, and while as a mental load easier to reason about, you lose one server and you've potentially lost the entire Raft quorum across 3 different services. The other major reason we're moving off of this, and we are moving to a pattern where we have separate server pools. Now, as we don't run Vault in a Raft configuration, we use Console as its backing store, we will scale that down to a more reasonable size based on usage. What we've noticed, though, is that across HashiCorp, there are very much different teams, and they each have their own release cadence, and they each have their own way they ship binaries. And so we wound up with either what we referred to internally as the dreaded triple, where we would need to upgrade Nomad, Console, and Vault in a single maintenance window, or where we would have just the marathon triple, where it was usually 3 maintenance windows in a week to bring everybody up to the latest version. And that's actually why we're still on 0.9, because it was a very eventful maintenance window, and we kind of said, let's not do that for a while. So it was let's look at what the next plan is going to be to update. And part of that plan involved make the updates less critical.
Yeah. And how nice would it be if you could just use Nomad to do the updates to the other projects?
So I will say, in my past life working for Google, one of the things that I thought was super cool was running Borg on Borg. And that was one of the things that I was really surprised that Nomad didn't have that functionality when I first looked at it. That you couldn't put a Nomad master on Nomad.
Isn't that the setup that Roblox is using, though? Aren't they running Nomad on top of Nomad?
It is. It is. People do that. You're not going to find it in our documentation.
So they're doing something slightly different.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Please, yeah, go ahead.
They're doing the infrastructure Nomad and the application Nomad. I'm talking about the self-bootstrapping path where you have a single Nomad server, bootstrap a bunch of clients, and then your Nomad masters become auto-migrating tasks running on Nomad, so that at that point, you no longer have special machines.
That sounds cool.
Yes, yeah, that's that is definitely an ability that we're interested in.
Looking into what it takes to do that, though, I have so much more respect for the team at Google that made that happen there.
I was gonna say I don't. It's been a long time since I've actually read the Borg paper. Did that functionality actually make it into the paper, or was that focused more on the scheduler design?
So the paper, as far as I'm aware, talks much more about the academic design of the scheduler.
Yeah.
And this was something that was just a passing reference in the bottom of a Kubernetes deck of like, oh yes, by the way, if you run the whole thing on top of its own workers, your machines aren't special anymore.
Interesting.
But you pay a heavy premium to do that. It means that your bootstrap story becomes very interesting.
Yeah.
That's
okay. Cool. One more question for you, and then I'll leave you alone. I promise. The other thing I was wondering, we're Thomas Weber is a Nomad user, great community member. He created the Nomad Podman driver, and we're taking a look at it right. Podman, for anybody watching who's unaware, is another container runtime like Docker. It's highly Docker compatible. It should feel like Docker in just about every way, except there's no Docker daemon is one of the significant changes. And I think they're running as containers as non-root story is really good as well. Those are, off the top of my head, the 2 big benefits I can remember. Anyway, we have this great community driver. We're looking into how to support it better right now. Is that something that you would find useful, you would be interested in, or does the Docker daemon kind of meet your needs today and you're not interested in changing out more things out from underneath your stack?
Oh no, I always love to ask, why did things become standard? I've been following the development of that Podman driver very closely, actually. One of the long-term stretch goals we had was nothing in our stack actually requires to be run as root. So having Docker run as root and then needing Nomad to run with elevated privileges, it's an interesting security story, especially where you have self-service job management, where if somebody really wanted to with a Nomad cluster, I don't think you could do this in ours. We have too much in your way to do that. But you probably could get a root level task running out on a machine if you configure according to what's in the learn.hashicorp.com guides. An interesting thing we actually don't run Nomad as root even now. We run it with capsysadmin, which might as well be root, and then a handful of other capabilities that let it talk to the Docker daemon. So that and of course, once you have Docker, you have root. But we didn't like the idea of running the control plane as root.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes total sense and would be, a great goal for us to make that potentially the default, or at least something we more explicitly document and support.
To hook into that, Michael, Schmeigel Michael.
Yeah,
there's a
Schmeigel's
question from the chat. So is there an official Podman support yet? And is it in the pipeline? So you touched on this briefly, but maybe you want to elaborate on it.
Yeah. Right now, it's not officially supported. Right now, it's still a community driver, but we're actively talking with Thomas. We're actively figuring out what that would look like to make it officially supported. So it hasn't happened yet, so I don't want to make any promises. But yeah, we're definitely working with him, and he's been really great. So hopefully we'll have some exciting news on that front here in the next few weeks.
Another question about Chris's talk. I see there's a lot of people asking about the Spinnaker Nomad provider. So the Spinnaker Nomad integration, is there any information on that yet? Or is there somewhere where people should stay tuned?
I'm working on it. I stopped working on it so that I could work on this talk. So that's actively in development. We didn't want to have to fork Spinnaker, and we didn't want to have to get these changes into upstream. So what we're doing is we're working with the Spinnaker maintainers. We're working with some of our partners. We're working with Armory to allow to get the changes into upstream Spinnaker so that we can do the Nomad Spinnaker cloud driver and all the other places in Spinnaker that we have to touch. So we can get all that done as a plugin so that you can actually just deploy that along with your Spinnaker deployment, wherever that happens to be. So it may go just a little bit slower that way, but it's gonna make it a lot easier for us to maintain in the long term. So, but that work is actively under development. It's literally what I'm going to start working on tomorrow when I get back to work tomorrow. And it'll be done. It'll be open source. The repo is not open source yet because there's not a lot in it, but it will be an open source, officially supported HashiCorp thing. So
cool. I think this question is for you, Michael. Do you have any persistent data in running on top of Nomad? And if so, how do you manage that?
So we don't have data that is persistent in the strictest sense. We do have a very, very large distributed cache that if we lost it, it would be painful for a day or two while the cache refilled. For the little data that we do have that needs to be somewhat persistent, we bind mount in directories from the host and just write to disk there. Running on 0.9, we don't have container storage interface available, but that is definitely a feature I'm excited about to see, what can we do with persistent data workloads?
I don't remember exactly anymore. Does 0.9 already have the host volume support?
I believe they were tech preview at that point.
Okay. So you're not using that to mount it in, you're just bind mounting it.
It's just a Docker bind mount.
Okay. Another question, and I'm assuming that's also for you or for the entire panel, whoever wants to pick it up. could you potentially use Nomad to deploy router configs and restart routers in blue-green by monitoring a centralized control plane? Who would like to take a stab at that?
I can take a stab at that, actually. So
Cool.
in doing a lot of stuff with Alpine and Nomad, I've done a lot of conversation with the team that runs Alpine's distribution infrastructure. We've looked at what it would take to run Alpine on top of Nomad, and one of the really cool things they do is they use DMVPN to do a multi-point spanning virtual network across their surprisingly many number of servers. We concluded that it's technically possible to do this. You could manage your network control plane entirely from Nomad. The problem you run into is that if your network control plane is how all of your machines are talking to each other, then what is Nomad talking on? And we started running into this problem of you now need a control plane network for your control plane. And at some point there has to be a bottom, and how you bootstrap that was not a clear question. There was also a really interesting security question around this. Well, does that mean now Nomad is root in network? That wasn't something that we really had a good answer to. So it was kind of a, yeah, it's possible, but is it practical?
Yep, makes sense. I also had a question because you were talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, the OS that you're trying to move to, is that called Phoenix? Or was Phoenix just another word somewhere in that sentence?
No, so there's a set of blog articles, and the gentleman's name escapes me right now, who back in the early 2000s wrote a lot about what today we consider to be the future of DevOps. He coined the phrase Phoenix server. The idea that your server will rise from the ashes. There is no configuration management on it. If you want to change the image, just rebuild. The technology that we build these server images with is called Linux Kit. If
Okay.
you've dug deep into Docker internals, this is what powers Docker for Mac. It basically, from nothing, builds a system image, and it can do this for most major cloud providers. It can spit out things you can pixie boot. It's kind of a Swiss Army knife of building distributions if you can get your source artifacts as Docker file systems.
Okay.
Or even OCI file systems.
So basically the entire OS would then be Docker images
Yes,
or container images.
Right, though they don't actually run in Docker. It's distinct from how something like Flatcar Linux works.
Okay. But would that mean that Nomad in your eventual use case would then also be running in this manner?
Yes, so Nomad being odd man out within the Hashi stack to not have an official Docker image, we build a custom Docker image that contains Nomad. We shove that into the image, and it's actually run directly under run C.
Okay.
So on init, there's about a 50-line script that bootstraps run C, loads some config into it, and launches the other tasks. The whole system is namespaced. So Nomad is actually not in the namespace where it can see Docker.
Okay.
We have some loop-mounted sockets that allow Nomad to see the partition of the image that has Docker in it, but not the other way around.
Okay, that's pretty
So
cool.
it very much is the kind of thing now where you might be able to compromise a task. You might even be able to compromise the entire Docker domain in this image, but it would be very, very difficult. You would need multiple levels of container escape to get the whole machine.
Wow, that's nice. I need to take a look at that.
Well, hopefully I can hastily write some more documentation before you do.
Okay. So is there any question, Michael, that you would maybe, now you have a bunch of engineers here, that you would like to ask the team directly?
Sure. I think the biggest question I would ask is, so Nomad still has this concept of management tokens. And this is something that's caused us a lot of grief with trying to bootstrap clusters automatically or use Vault integration for identity. this is actually even a problem in our existing production clusters. We have to save these tokens actually in a safe. Is there a plan to kind of get rid of that and go more towards the capabilities-based system that Consul seems to have adopted?
Who's gonna take this one?
I'll actually just poke that question a little more and then send it to Michael Schroeder. But I guess the thing that would be necessary for getting rid of management tokens would be to make sure that all of the things right now that are currently only possible with a management token show up in the fine-grained ACL system. So we have a list of those, right? We've identified a couple of those over the period. And it's just a matter of making them accessible via ACL. So what do you think?
So the short version is, boy, we'd love to do that, but that's, it's not on the roadmap yet. The long version is there's kind of three related concerns here, or even features here that we're all kind of thinking about and working on orthogonally. But I think they're related, and we'd like to kind of tell one cohesive story with them eventually. The first one being getting a better SSO story for authenticating against a Nomad cluster. That's something that I think we're going to be able to piggyback on some more consolists doing in that area, and that'll just do things like make it so you don't have to copy and paste a token into the Nomad UI. Not have to copy and paste a token into an environment variable, all that sort of thing. A nice SSO flow for operators to start interacting with the cluster. Not related to the management token yet, but that's kind of one aspect of authentication that we're working on actively. The next aspect is kind of, you can kind of think of it as the next step kind of in an operator's workflow. Would be Nomad doesn't have service accounts for jobs. We allow you to specify vault policies for jobs, and allow you to get credentials based off of those and that sort of thing. And that is incredibly useful, is incredibly powerful. Everybody should be using it today, but it's not a service account. It's not an identity for each allocation running in your cluster, for each instance of a task running in your cluster. And so we know we need service accounts, and it's definitely something that we're sketching out, trying to figure out the right shape for that. And then this kind of third effort, would be a more capability-based approach to authentication within the Nomad cluster itself, not for services, not just for SSO, but for the authorization once you're actually operating inside Nomad, a more capabilities approach. And why all of these might be interrelated is we might be able to use something like JWTs, or an idea similar to macaroons from Google, where you kind of can have a single, I'm not going to use the right terminology here off the top of my head, but a single credential blob to represent your capabilities. It's signed, it's secured, and can kind of use that throughout a workflow where you get this thing via SSO. An operator never has to see it or use it. It gets passed along through the CLI to the API. The API knows what capabilities to look for based on the operation that you're performing. At no point is there any need for it to look up an actual token somewhere. It can just check that there are signed capabilities available. And then we might be able to use those capabilities for the service then as well, once those services get deployed as part of that service identity, where if the person submitting the job has access to services A, B, and C, and they're deploying service D, well, great, let's pluck out those three capabilities and carry that down the line. So I'm sure anyone with deeper knowledge of these systems off the top of their head might be cringing at my very high level, rough description of them. But I wanted to kind of paint this picture of what we're thinking about to kind of overhaul our entire credentialing, authentication, authorization system. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to all land, in one big chunk. I think SSO will kind of be the first chunk. Service accounts will probably be the second chunk. And so that means doing something about the management token is going to come last. But we'll get there. We'll get there. Because yeah, it's kind of the MVP, right? A management token is kind of the minimum viable product for this sort of thing. It's like, oh, we need some root of trust here. Okay, we have a root account, and it's not ideal.
When
Cool,
you say service accounts for the tasks, will that also be leveraging what Console already somewhat does with Connect, like giving services unique identities, or?
Yeah, so it's how all of that will interact is definitely what is work in progress right now. Because yeah, we obviously at HashiCorp, we want you to, the Unix philosophy is at work here. Each product kind of has our own lane. We want to stay in our lane. The service accounts is definitely an area where there will be some crossover between Nomad and Console, because like you said, Console already has this idea of service identities. And so exactly how we relate those two identities is still being designed. And so yes, we're going to make sure to take that into account, but we haven't figured out exactly what that'll look like yet.
All right. So if I'm not mistaken, we are at time. Is that correct? It's because of the time zones I'm confused. Yes, I see people nodding. Okay. If there are any further questions, you might want to head over to the Discuss forums. So that's discuss.hashicorp.com, where you can ask any questions on any of the products. We're checking those frequently. And there's also a lot of very helpful community members that answer a lot of the questions there. Thank you, Schmeigel, for posting the link. And then, of course, there's learn.hashicorp.com if you want to dig into some of the HashiCorp features, which Schmeigel is typing the URL of now. I assumed.
Wait, whoops. You got ahead of me. What am I typing now?
Oh, I thought learn.hashicorp.com.
On it.
It looked like your typing face.
I'm madly copying and pasting everywhere I can.
Oh, that's okay. And then, of course, we will be having HashiConf Digital in June. So keep an eye out for that. There's also going to be training sessions there that will be very interesting for a lot of people. With that, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your story and the very interesting use case. I've never thought of using Alpine as an actual OS for everything outside of containers. So that was very insightful. Thank you, Chris, for your talk, and everybody on the panel, of course. Thank you so much. With that, have a good day, all of you.